us in everything. From sky to ocean deep, your love goes on. Through every rise and fall, we are forever lost. One thing we know is sure, your love goes on and on and on. Only love.
Hey everyone, welcome to Thursday Night Live. My name is Tiffany, and I'm so glad to be here with you tonight. Hey, do me a favor right now, drop a comment in the chat, and I want to see the best meme that you can find that describes your week this week. You know, speaking of memes, I actually have a couple memes that I think are hysterical about 2020 and the season that we're in. Check these out. You know, we may laugh at these memes, but the truth is our world has come to a halt. You know, many things have just stopped. Hanging out with friends? Forget about it. Going to the beach? Not a chance. Had a Disney pass? Doesn't matter. Your sports season? Done. And your work? Furloughed. I mean, so many things have just completely come to a screeching halt, and that's the season that we find ourselves in right now. We might even start to lose purpose in all of this. We may not say this audibly or even really think about it in a way that's articulated like this, but if we're really honest with ourselves, we might even subconsciously start to ask ourselves this question: has my purpose come to a halt? Has my purpose been furloughed? I mean, should I just go ahead and wash my hands of 2020 and just pick back up in 2021 or whenever this whole thing is over? You know, if you found yourself thinking these thoughts over the last month, my guess is that you're not the only one thinking this. You know, if I had to give this talk a title, I would call it Purpose in the Pivot. Purpose in the Pivot. You know, I grew up playing basketball. I loved playing basketball. It was so much fun. And growing up, my all-time favorite basketball player was Michael Jordan. I had Michael Jordan basketball cards. I had Michael Jordan toys. I had Michael Jordan everything. I loved it. I couldn't get enough Michael Jordan. In fact, right now, I have a Michael Jordan jersey in my closet. I never wear it, but I have it. You know, when I think back to my b-ball days, I think back to those days in practice, you know, when all I wanted to do was shoot the shot. But there was actually another fundamental that my coach taught me. And he talked about how this was so important when it came to playing the game. This was going to actually be the thing that would help me navigate anything that happened during that game. And here was the fundamental principle that we had to get down, and it was to learn how to pivot. Now, here's the beauty of a pivot. There's no doubt our objective is clear. You know, score a point. But when you're going, there's going to be opposition that comes your way. And when opposition comes your way, that does not stop your objective. Instead, we don't just stop when opposition happens. What we do is we put our foot on the ground and we pivot so that we can get around the opposition so we can still accomplish our purpose to get that W. And you know, my coach was right, because every time I would drive down the court, there would always be somebody who was trying to block me, who was trying to stop me from accomplishing my objective. And when they would come at me, instead of just stopping and just quitting what I'm trying to do, so what I would do is I would stop and I would pivot. And a pivot looks a little different than where I was naturally going to go. A pivot changed my plans a little bit, but it did not change my objective. And I believe this, that when it comes to our purpose, there is still purpose in the pivot. A lot of our normal routine has been completely halted. A lot of things have come to a stop. And what we might do is we might assume that one of those things is our purpose. Could it be that because everything else has actually subsided, because everything else that used to get my attention and your attention now is out of the picture because we have to come to a pause? Maybe this could be the time that you embrace your purpose in a way that you've never done before. I believe this, that there are men and women throughout history who in the moment of crisis, in the moment of disaster, in the moment of disease, what they did was they did not push pause on their purpose, but instead they pursued their purpose. And because they were pursuing their purpose, they were able to pivot. And when they pivoted, it was incredible things that happened. History is made up of people who in these situations chose not to press pause, to have purpose in the pivot. And because they chose to do that, history will never be the same. And I believe that for such a time as this, God has put you here in 2020 to do the same. God has put me here in 2020 to do the same. It is not a time to pause, but it is a time to pursue. It is a time to pivot. And I believe this, that God wants to do extraordinary things in and through you, not when this is all over, but now, in this moment. There's no doubt that purpose is something that we long for. Purpose is something that we hope for, that we're trying to discover, that we're trying to figure out. And the idea of purpose is incredible. But when we try to actually put legs to it, when we try to figure out what does that mean for me? What is my purpose? I know that that's something that so many people struggle with. How do I know that? Because one of the best-selling books of all time is called Purpose-Driven Life, written by Rick Warren, and it sold over 30 million copies. In fact, it was so popular that he just retitled the book, What on Earth Am I Here For? And sold more. Why? Because we're all desperate to figure out what on earth we're here for. We're all desperate to figure out what our purpose is. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever thought about what your purpose is? Maybe you've never said, what on earth am I here for? But maybe you're wondering, even right now, in the midst of COVID-19, what on earth am I here for? Now, this is a bigger discussion than just our short talk tonight, but let me give you the Cliff Notes version. Are you ready for this? Get out your pen, get out your phone. You're going to want to write this down. Our purpose is to glorify God, period. I know, it's earth-shattering. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says this, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. So what does that mean for us? I mean, it sounds really cool. Like it's a thing that we can declare, but what does that mean for you and I right now? When it comes to making decisions, we actually use this as our filter. Every decision that we make, will this bring glory to God or will it not? If the answer is yes, then go for it. If the answer is no, then it's pretty clear. This purpose isn't just for you when it comes to your spirituality. It's not just designed for pastors and people who work at church or those spiritual people. This is actually supposed to be the operating system in which we live by. In every arena of our lives, when it comes to what you spend your money on, will this glorify God or not? When it comes to who you're spending time with, will this glorify God or not? Everything that we do, we can ask this one question to determine whether it's going to propel us toward our purpose or whether it is going to hold us back from our purpose. Purpose is powerful. And if you choose to never really pursue your purpose, then could it be that feeling inside of you, that longing for something more, that desire for joy and connection and satisfaction, could it be that the reason that you're not experiencing those things is because you haven't pursued your purpose? And on the flip side, if you have pursued your purpose, if you started looking into what this could mean for you, have you experienced that joy? Have you experienced that satisfaction? Have you experienced just that fullness of life that God has to offer you because you're living in your purpose? Purpose is powerful. And so I want to encourage you over the next few moments to lean in. I want to encourage you to not check out, because I believe that if we embrace our purpose, even in the midst of a situation that we could have never dreamed of, that God could transform us from the inside out, and that over the next week, over the next 2 weeks, over the next month or a couple months, that this could actually be the time in your life where you experience more joy than you've ever experienced in your life, where you can experience more peace than you've ever experienced in your life, and where you can experience what it's truly like to live in the purpose that God has created you to live. Once you get a taste of that, man, there's no going back. Right after college, I started working for my church part-time, and I loved it. It was awesome. You see, years before, I had surrendered my entire life to God. I said, God, whatever you want me to do, I'm in. Because I believed that he had a purpose for me. And I was so excited to do whatever he wanted me to do. I couldn't wait for what the future held. And I remember that as I was working part-time at my church, I was pumped. But I was only there part-time, and to make ends meet, I had to wait tables on the weekends and at night. And, I remember thinking to myself, man, this stinks. Like, this is not what I had hoped for. I went to college, I graduated, I gave my life to God. I was ready to serve him in the purpose that he had called me to. And so I remember as I was waiting tables, there were times that if you've never waited tables before, this is something like crazy. But there, you know how you get the silverware and it's all rolled up? People do that. And by people, I mean me. I would do that. We would spend the first 45 minutes of our shift rolling silverware. And I remember one day I was just so irritated because I felt like, God, I want to be used by you. I want to live the fullness of my purpose. Why do I have to be waiting tables on the side? This is such sideways energy. This doesn't make any sense. So I'm having this internal conversation with God as I'm rolling silverware. And to be honest with you, man, I was irritated that day. And as I was rolling silverware, I just was thinking about all of this. It was just like racing in my head. And the girl across the table who I was working with was rolling silverware with me. And she started asking me about my day. She started asking me about my life. And she asked me, hey, what else do you do? And I'm like, oh, I work a second job. She's like, oh, that's cool. Where do you work? And I'm rolling silverware, and I'm just like frustrated still with this whole situation that I can't live in my purpose. And I'm like, I work at my church, and I just keep rolling silverware. She's like, really? What church is that? And I'm like, it's High Street Baptist Church, And then she just keeps asking questions, and I'm so frustrated because this is such sideways energy. I want to help people find and follow Jesus, and this person is getting in my way. And it wasn't until a few moments later that I recognized that this was not a pause in my purpose, but instead there was purpose in this pivot. Here I was, frustrated that God wasn't giving me what I thought I needed to accomplish the purpose that he had for me, while all the while there was literally somebody across the table begging for an invitation for church. I finally recognized that I really needed to embrace this purpose in the pivot. And I invited her to come to church with me, and I was able to have a discussion about who God was and how there's this incredible God in heaven who loves her and has a plan and a purpose for her. But I almost missed it because things weren't what I expected. And I think that right now you and I are experiencing something that was not expected. We may have said yes to the purpose that we thought God had for us, but then 2020 hit and the coronavirus hit, and now we're thinking, whoa, God, how in the world am I supposed to embrace my purpose? How am I supposed to pursue my purpose when everything has come to a halt? Surely my purpose has too. Could it be, and this is my main takeaway for today, that God wants you to embrace your purpose in the pivot? Throughout the Bible, there are so many stories of people who were pursuing their purpose, and in the midst of that pursuit, they had to embrace their purpose in the pivot. One of my favorite stories is the story of Joseph. Joseph had a vision that God wanted to use him in a mighty way, but Joseph's story was far from a straight line towards his destiny. In fact, his story is full of twists and turns. He finds himself in the midst of this slave trade, and he's sold to this Egyptian master named Potiphar. And in that moment, he could have very easily thought to himself, I'm just a slave. My purpose has paused. And if it hasn't paused, maybe it's just gone altogether because this is crazy. How in the world could I pursue my purpose in the midst of slavery? And yet, he knew what his real purpose was. His real purpose was to glorify God. And so no matter what was happening, every decision he made, he decided, okay, is it going to glorify God? I'm doing that. Is it not? I'm not doing that. And that is what dictated how he lived his life as a slave. And what happened was that God blessed the work of his hand. And then later, after that, he gets thrown in prison. And I'm sure that when he got thrown in prison, he thought, I gave it a shot. There's no way that I've got purpose in the pivot now. This is too much. I'm literally in prison. But in prison, he went back to his true purpose, his purpose of, will this glorify God or not? And every decision that he made, he said, okay, if this glorifies God, I'm going to do it. And if it doesn't, that's that. And throughout his time in prison, God elevated him, God gave him favor, and God did some incredible things. I believe that not only do we need to embrace the purpose and the pivot, but we need to believe that God has actually positioned the pivot for us. See, what Joseph didn't see was that God was making these pre-moves on behalf of Joseph. When Joseph was faithful to just glorify God, even though he couldn't see everything that was going to happen, when Joseph was faithful to say, God, I'm not giving up. I believe that you still have a purpose for my life, even though this is not how I saw my year going, even though this is not how I saw my life going or the season going, I am not giving up. And what he didn't know was that God was actually arranging so many things. And we don't have time to go into all of that, but check it out. It's an incredible story. And at the very end of his story, he actually becomes the prime minister of Egypt. This vision that he had as a young man actually became a reality. But see, it would have never happened had he pushed pause on his purpose. It would have never happened had he given up. It would have never happened if he would have stopped looking at what his ultimate purpose was, which was to glorify God. He would have been stuck. He would have been left feeling like, man, I don't know where my life went. I just got a bad hand. There's no way that this is my fault. But the thing is, circumstances were way out of his control. His life was turned upside down. And yet, in the midst of that, he was able to pursue his purpose. He was able to recognize that there was purpose in the pivot. And in the end, God was glorified. And Joseph was able to see that God was actually in control, even though the circumstances around him did not make any sense. Today, we find ourselves in the midst of seasons that don't make any sense. We find ourselves in the midst of a season where we feel like it is out of our control and there is no way in the world that we can actually pursue our purpose. But remember that even though everything seemingly has come to a halt, we can still have purpose in the pivot. So here's my challenge for you today. Pursue your purpose, embrace the pivot, and remember that God has actually gone before you and he wants to use you now. Hey, thanks for joining us for Thursday Night Live. We're going to sing another song and make sure to hop on Instagram because we're going live right after this.
Lord bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace.
your children and your children and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family and their children and their children and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and their children and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family and your children and your children and their children. May his presence go before you and behind you and around